Okay, good morning. Today is Friday, April 5th, 2024. This is the second half of the morning session for Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're looking at Bill H 687, Activating Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection through Land Use. And joined now by Secretary Moore from the Agency of Natural Resources. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming in. We're a day into this bill. We're still reading through in detail. But I'd like to pause and hear thoughts from you on 687 in particular. And I suppose if it's awkward not to say something about another bill that's addressing the same areas like 311, 308, whatever, feel free to call it outside the lines. But really, it was 687 that we due to few points.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. For the record, Julie Moore and our secretary. I apologize that I didn't have the benefit of getting to listen to Chair Haskell's testimony, so hopefully I won't be too repetitive with things she said, recognizing in the Venn diagram there is a fairly significant overlap between the work of our two organizations. I just want to start by reflecting that the version of 687 that passed the House moved significantly in the direction of the recommendations of the NRB study, and we are really appreciative of that, particularly as it relates to the thinking around tiered jurisdiction for Act 250, and frankly, the need for additional time to really dig into what it would take to have a working definition for Tier 3. I'd like to spend my time with you this morning talking more about an area of the bill that didn't receive the same level of attention, although one that I see is absolutely critical to a successful implementation, which is governance. I know that governance in some ways is sort of probably boring and also a little bit inside baseball, but frankly, it is critical to the ability for this work to get done successfully. And so to my mind, that's including both the restructuring of the NRB as well as the appeals process. So in terms of the NRB restructure, ANR and the NRB study both support the professionalized board with a greater capacity to manage the work around Act 250. That's coming from our vantage that reflects the recognition that there is a need for more centralized guidance that exists today, and that will only increase if we are making significant changes to Act 250 substance and scope, which is what's contemplated at 687. But instead of providing a governance model that's responsive to that need, 687 right now creates a 5-person semi or quasi-professional board with 1 full-time member and 4 part-time members. There's a complicated process for nominating new members, but really the bigger concern is about how those board members will come up to speed and what their scope of duties will be. Because 687 expands Act 250 jurisdiction, the volume of Act 250 permits, I think we should all anticipate will increase potentially significantly.
Can I check in on that one just for a second? So, what makes it, I mean, the simple version is what makes you say that? Because I've been thinking about how right now Act 250 can apply. There's one way in which you could take the map of Vermont and color it all in color and say Act 250 applies here.
Yeah.
As long as you trigger an Act 250. And so when you look at it and say, oh, well, there's going to be more jurisdictions, what are you seeing so that I'm not doubting the concern, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, it would be the changes in jurisdictional triggers. So one is the road rule that's contemplated in 687. There is a lot of land that is brought in under the road rule, and it would have potentially a lower number of housing units as a trigger as compared to current Act 250. And then ultimately how critical resource areas are defined. As I'm sure you're all aware, the House took a couple of different swings at that. We worked to map what those different definitions of critical resource area were, and they would have had pretty darn close to universal Act 250 jurisdiction outside of areas that were considered Tier 1 or Tier 2 by virtue of either being a critical resource area or because they would in all likelihood fall under the road rule.
Okay, so I think now I'm thinking aloud with you. It seems like when some people talk about it, I hear it when we're conflating an area that's mapped as 1A, 1B, 2, or 3, which I'm thinking actually ends up the entire state again.
Correct.
And then within it, though, there are the thresholds and discretionary triggers that will entail more or less work by boards, and as long as they're, even if we're sweeping all of Vermont back into a new location-based scheme, I'm thinking if we manage the triggers well, that we also run a manageable program.
I agree,
Okay.
and I think, but my understanding of the intention in advancing this legislation is to expand the jurisdiction of Act 250 in general in areas outside of our designated centers that are largely already exempt from because of their growth center designations.
Okay, and I guess that's not clear to me yet, because I haven't seen like, let's see, for what a map, I've also been thinking that we're expanding the number of areas where we're saying actually more.
Yeah, our best work, and it's been done by the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and would encourage you to hear from them, is there are about 25 to 30 municipalities where Tier 1A would apply. It is a very small subset. How many? 25 to 30. That's more than I thought. Well, and it depends on the criteria. To be frank, haven't gone through a detailed review of the as passed version, sort of line by line to know, but there were a couple of pieces related to wildlife and some other interests that were added to Tier 1A. And frankly, no community would currently comply. But there are 25 to 30 that maybe it's a reasonable step to get.
They would need, for instance, a wildlife bylaw.
Oh, yeah, that's correct.
And then have you looked at all 1B, sort of envisioned where those opportunities are and whether or not that also could, well, for one thing, in 1A, I'm thinking of them as bigger than just the designated areas, although that's only based on conversation. No one's come in and said, here's what a designated downtown looks like. Here's what a 1A area looks like. And I think part of that impression for me is going to create, there was proposals like designated downtowns plus half a mile, village centers plus a quarter mile, that kind of thing.
Correct. So some of that's in 311.
Yeah, okay, so we'll have to,
I would encourage you to hear from Commissioner Farrell in Housing and Community Development. He's spent a considerable amount of time looking at that.
great, thank you.
So I'm operating under the premise there would be more projects coming through Act 250. And I think that that needs to factor into our thinking in that part of the proposal in the NRB study was to create a professional NRB board that didn't hear appeals, with the idea that it could provide that consistency and oversight across all of the district commissions, which would help prevent slowing the permitting and bogging down of an already intensive process as additional criteria are developed and brought to application. In terms.
You thought, sorry, you're up again, just. Once the board is fully fledged, up and running, maybe it's a year in, I mean, there's also this, Chair Haskell was talking about the possibility of reconsidering the appeals question once the professional board was fully operational on like a year into that. Is that still an open question in your mind? Are you, did I say this?
I did not say.
Okay, so I thought it was that you were proposing that the legislature might, so let me make sure I have it right, that we might reconsider that question in 2029.
2029, yes, sorry, I thought you said a year.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think on down the line, it's worth reconsidering, but out of the gate, we are opposed to moving appeals of Act 250 permits to the ERB, whatever name it is with that. I'll start with the most selfish reason, and that's because it's gonna create a resource drain on the agency, and that we would need to participate in appeals of DEC permits that continue to come to the E-court. as well as Act 250 permits, sometimes for the same cases in front of an ERB. So it's a drain on our staff time to have two separate proceedings as opposed to a consolidated appeal. But beyond that, the world is much more complicated it was when 20 years ago when the e-board last heard appeals. Especially I think when it pertains to some of the issues around DECA and our permits. And coupled with any expansion in Act 250 jurisdiction, it's really unclear to me how a quasi-professional board could manage that caseload. One of the other pieces of it,
Sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
Listening to each word, so quasi-professional, as opposed to professional, does that mean that instead of the 5 meaning 1 plus 4 fractions, that it's just 5 full-time?
I can't remember if it was 5 full-time or 3. Yeah, 4 part-time, 2/3 time.
Yeah.
And 1 full-time, 1 full, yeah.
So it's a little bit more robust of a proposal. But it would also, it avoids the need for a firewall, like the professionalized NRB board has a very different function and role than what is envisioned for the ERB. My understanding is the ERB is envisioned to hear appeals de novo, which means it would require a firewall between the ERB and the district commission on major proceedings that have the potential for appeal. And really, in order, this firewall will have the practical effect of preventing hands-on guidance, information sharing, and support that I think is critical for the professional NRB to be able to provide to district commissions as we're looking at this next evolution of Act 250. You know, the firewall between the substantive work of district commissions on major cases and the new ERB limits their ability to help ensure this consistency across the Act 250 enterprise. So the only chance the ERB will have to weigh in on issues raised in major cases would be on appeal. And this also has the practical effect of creating a confrontational relationship between the ERB and the district commissioners and coordinators of the ERB. By virtue of that role, is going to be revisiting their decisions and has the potential to change or overturn them. And so just thinking about that inside government dynamic is important and encourage you to think carefully about that. Rather than working in a supportive and collaborative way as a professional board would, the appeal structure currently contemplated in 687 will exacerbate what can at times already be, from our perspective, a tense relationship between some of the district coordinators and commissions in the NRB. And I feel like this is opposite the outcome that Vermonters have been asking for in Act 250 modernization. And frankly, the agency sees as one of the clear benefits of Act 250 modernization. A professional board that would work collaboratively to support and direct decisions out of districts and to ensure consistency and appropriate application of the law on a statewide basis.
So their principal tasks would be in the near term development of the definitions of tiers and maps, review of maps related to those tiers and designation, okay, and then ongoing, their main function would be, well, I think that will be static, but then on an ongoing basis, you're thinking of their principal function as being development of policy. So
I don't know the principal function, but it's an important function. It's a critical function. Next thought I could talk briefly about de novo versus on the record review. And I know that in theory, de novo appeals allow for a less formal process for the initial permit, which people see as having value since there isn't a need to establish a formal record to be used in appeal. That said, I think when we're talking specifically about Act 250 major proceedings, they're already pretty formal, complex, and typically involve legal representation, paid consultants, and so forth. And so creating record during an Act 250 major proceeding could be more straightforward than perhaps is envisioned, establishing baseline evidentiary standards, recording the hearing, and potentially providing some additional procedural elements such as discovery. The perceived relative informality of an Act 250 hearing wouldn't necessarily need to change all that much from our vantage to create a record.
And is this just for majors? So majors would be on the record. Others that had a less formal initial process could go de novo and went to.
That is an option and something that I think gets us 80% of the way to what we've been looking at.
Sure, and it's really in our big stat, but I don't have it in my head, which is the percentage of majors versus minors that go through a appeal.
Yeah. We have 10 to 20 majors a year. Out of 400 permits.
Okay.
So it is a relatively small number, but they are disproportionate consumers of time and staff time and resources. So, you know, I think the upshot to me is looking realistically at the existing level of formality in Act 250 nature cases. I don't think it's not clear to me at least that things would change all that much to hold those hearings on the record. So there may be value in looking into that further. My understanding, and I don't know, Sabina, or you know, is that some years ago there was a pilot or some sort of opportunity for parties to request on the record review as part of an Act 250 proceeding, but I'm not actually sure if anyone did.
They took it up.
I think no one took it
You know,
after a lot of angst.
Right.
to create.
Right.
So the thing that you're proposing was a pilot and people didn't use it.
Correct.
Oh. It's too bad.
Chose not to go.
Chose- chose.
Yes.
Yeah, the lawyers out there who are practicing in the area. Well, like, it would be good for their business because they'd be busier, but that for their clients, they thought it might just add expense. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
the fact of the matter is we still don't know because no one's tried it out.
So I think my first year chairing this committee, we worked with Mr. Chapman, who was then GC, I think, up at A&R on de novo versus on the record appeal changes at A&R for state permits. And part of the whole thing was that it was like a pilot project. We would see what happened there, and it might suggest what ought to be done in the Act 250 domain. I didn't ask any question ahead of time. It's not like a surprise, not intended as a surprise question, but I just don't know what happened with that initiative. Because it was the same struggle on the record de novo. How does that work? And I thought that at A&R we piloted something, and honestly, I realized, you know, every once in a while I tell you, I don't know what happened there. And then
I would
I've been-
need to go back and check. I guess I'm not aware that that's happened. But I should go back and ask that. I mean, the bulk of our permits are general permits, and so the only opportunity to appeal them is when the general permit is on notice, not the individual applications. So that would be around individual permits presumably, but I'll go back and get.
Well, I don't know if we ran the experiment once and we already have something useful to look at.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I'll let you know. Just then to talk briefly about the remainder of H687 outside of appeals. I think you'll hear as a theme as I continue concerns about the resources provided to the agency to support what is a significant amount of work envisioned by 687. So first with the criteria, there's a new forest block and connecting habitat criteria. It's generally consistent with versions that A&R supported in the past and reflects largely the consensus recommendation of the NRB report. It would establish a no undue adverse inverse no undue adverse standard for impacts to forest blocks and connecting habitat, which is similar to the approach the agency already uses when engaging in these questions in front of the Public Utilities Commission.
Sure, like, do we do this for wetlands?
Correct.
Avoid, mitigate,
Yeah,
offset.
avoid, minimize, mitigate.
Okay.
So 687 would require the NRB to undertake rulemaking and consultation with ANR to further refine how forest blocks and habitat connectors are defined, sort of their size, location, et cetera, for the purposes of Act 250 regulation, and then map those resources. And as a supporting or necessary first step to being able to engage in that mitigation sequence, we just described Senator Frey. It does do a couple of other things. It establishes that unpaved recreational trails are not fragmenting creatures, which has been a question that's come up in a handful of proceedings. Nor are unpaved, yeah. Nor are improvements constructed for farmer logging or forestry purposes below 2,500 feet. And I think having those clarifications is useful. The NRB is required to convene a working group to provide input on the rule by July 1st of 2025. And file a Secretary of State by June 15th of 2026. We see this rulemaking is prudent, however, it will take staff time and resources from across the agency and most particularly in our Department of Fish and Wildlife. The bill has passed the House, I believe, makes provision for one position in the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we had indicated in our testimony, and it's also reflected in, I believe, the fiscal note for the bill, that in reality, we need at least two positions in the Department of Fish and Wildlife and one in our Office of Policy and Planning, that's sort of the agency lead on all of our Act 250 engagement.
So House version 1 to the department, you're recommending 1 administrative, 2 department.
Correct.
Thank you. And now should we be using the sort of default 150 for FTEs?
Yeah, I mean, that is our best guess. Section 22 of the bill speaks to resource mapping, and this is another place where ANR is asked to support that work. And that we're required to maintain GIS-based resource maps that may be used in Act 250 and expand maps to include forest blocks and habitat connectors. We'll also need to establish some new procedures, including a process and science-based criteria for how we will update those maps over time. And obviously we're gonna need some sort of public comment and engagement process in adopting those maps and the procedures in order to ensure public buy-in. And there are no resources currently provided. And so when I said 2 positions in Fish and Wildlife, 1 in the central office, we believe those 3 positions are sort of sufficient to cover all of the work in the bill. But that particular section has no resources currently associated with it.
Are you saying it needs resource?
Well, the 2 positions in Fish and Wildlife, 1 in policy would cover that as well.
Okay, and then in terms of mapping work itself, our current mapping budget sufficient to do that, you know, like, I don't know, if it's Moodle or whatever it is. Or sometimes we've had allocations like in 213 to hire in some outside resource on that.
So the underlying map for this work is anticipated to be Vermont Conservation Design, where we've already pulled much of that information in. And my understanding, and I would appreciate the opportunity to go back and double check with my team, but my understanding is this is more, the effort that's required is more one of biologists than GIS experts, in that it's going to be identifying subsets of some of the existing maps of forest blocks and connecting habitat.
And while we're talking on maps, we could just bookmark this. We've talked a little bit about trying to make sure that 213 and CK's done conduct. Playing together nice. Where it's thoughtful about how we do the mapping, so it's not duplicative or expensive, or sometimes one, and my hope is that one mapping effort can deliver useful data, both the 213 work and the Act 50.
Yeah, we work very hard to sort of take all of the different map products that the agency makes and have them available through the A&R Natural Resources Atlas. To avoid any unnecessary repeat work, but also to make sure that once we've gone through an analysis and done the quality control and quality assurance work, that it's broadly available to Vermonters to use.
Just from your point of view, with a department on the front line, the mapping in 213 and 687 as currently described.
So-
Fit together.
They
Or-
do, the mapping in 213 is a little bit more granular, I believe, than what's envisioned in 687, because my understanding has been it's really focused on infill mapping in the existing river corridors, so on 6.1, 6.2 million acres.
Yeah.
That mapping is focused on 200,000, right, versus the mapping that's envisioned under 687 would start at that landscape scale. It would be a subset of it, but it's still gonna be broader than what's taking place in 213.
I see your question from.
I do, I did a question for me, I'm not sure that it is fully there yet,
Okay.
I guess I'm thinking about this thought of the granularity that will be needed and coming back to this somewhat of a revelation that I feel like I had yesterday in talking to Representative Bongartz about that in a single municipality, you might have all 4 flavors of locations, jurisdictions, depending on the resources and which feels pretty granular, but I'm recognizing that it's a slightly different thing from what you're talking about, but anyway, I was just processing it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I think there is a level of complexity there that we probably haven't fully contemplated, which is sort of how those boundary conditions between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you, so having a degree in physics, boundary conditions means that's like a thing, and so do you mean
Like where they butt up,
literally?
yeah, where they butt up against each other and how you decide, right?
There might be like a buffer somehow?
So our Vermont conservation design is really built at the landscape scale, not the parcel scale. And so, similar to maybe how global climate models are at times very challenging to downscale to Vermont. Vermont conservation design may be very challenging to downscale to the parcel or sub-parcel level. We just published at the end of February a higher resolution version of these maps based on new data products we were able to obtain, and it helps. There are some like side-by-side images that the team put together, and frankly, it's a bit like putting on a pair of glasses where you go from much larger pixels to much smaller pixels. So the quality of the information is improving, but it hasn't been ground truth the same way river corridor infill mapping would be ground truth, right, where you're actually looking at buildings and lots, and that isn't a way we've worked with Vermont conservation design today. So there's thinking that needs to happen there. To me, that's part of the reason tier 3 really needs to sort of be sent off for some additional process and work by a technical team and come back with a set of recommendations about how to effectively implement it.
I can also, natural systems don't know anything about property lines.
Municipal boundaries.
Like those are like abstract legal lines, so it seems like it's highly likely, right? The norms that natural boundary lines are gonna cross many
Absolutely.
parcels, and part of the parcel will be in and part of the parcel will be out.
Absolutely. I can see that, and I guess, I haven't read 687 closely enough to know if the intention is. If it was a critical resource area that was also in a tier 1A area. What controls?
It's reminding me a little of wetlands, so you can own a parcel, just I know. It's probably a trigger word, everyone hold their ears. You can end up with a wetlands delineation on a larger parcel.
Yeah.
And then, so some of it in, some of it's controlled in a certain way and it isn't, so.
Yeah,
I suppose that's just a word to the wise, kind of cautionary thing.
correct.
Yeah. I'm just mindful of time, we're gonna, unfortunately, we have to go upstairs in about 10 minutes.
All right, I've got not too much more.
Okay.
And
And we can certainly schedule more time, but we can
happy to come
jump
back.
in with questions.
Section 23 has some pieces that we are very strongly in support of, specifically reducing the prime ag soil mitigation ratio for wood product manufacturers to 1:1. This is also consistent with the NRB study and really recognizes the vital role forest products enterprises play in preserving our working landscapes. So amending the ag soils mitigation ratio and then looking at opportunities for some other permanent process efficiencies are both things we are supportive of coming out of this study. In terms of the road rule, which is sections 24 and 25 of the bill, this is generally consistent with what's been discussed in past sessions and what's in the NRB report, with the exception of the 800-foot from a single road trigger. And as you might imagine, that does tend to have the potential to bring in quite a bit more of the Vermont landscape under automatic jurisdiction. Appreciating the road rule is really intended to capture fragmenting development. But the rule as drafted isn't limited to development in forests. And so that's something that may also wanna be considered. It does require NRD rule making for the road rule, but I think that's something ANR anticipates having a fairly active role in. And again, this is one of those places that we believe will expand the number of projects subject to active jurisdiction.
I'm not quite, I'm failing to follow a little bit. If it's not, you could, the other reason you might build a road would be actually logging road,
Yeah.
farm road. So those are excluded as triggering. So what's the concern? Because what other reason would you have an 800-foot plus road if it weren't for development?
Yeah,
No, it's more that in unforested areas, an 800-foot road would also trigger the road rule. It was the opposite of that. It's saying because the road rule is envisioned to capture this fragmented development. There are instances where you could trigger the road rule where it's unlikely that it's actually having that
Like
fragment.
a very large hayfield.
Correct.
Okay.
but it would be exempt because of being a farm. So I guess that my question would be, what's an example? You would say, I'm not really aware of people doing those very long driveways in situations where it's not a forest or farm.
Well, it would be if farmland was being converted to large home subdivision, essentially.
Well, I think we should review that too. I mean, that's, so.
Correct, but the road rule specifically is talking, like the underlying premise of the need for the road rule is fragmenting habitat. There is.
I have other reasons.
Correct.
So I understand what you're saying. Okay, yes, I would say for me, one of the main reasons that I do support the road rule is because it does follow historical patterns of development that we've seen in Vermont. Although forest fragmentation is very important to me, it's also about the characteristics that our communities have long developed and access to resources. So I think I understand your point, but it seems like a very small group of people that would be triggered that wouldn't be in.
So we're probably gonna be talking about this more, Senator Watson, and then
I'm picturing situation where maybe you want a driveway to get like behind a big box store, right? Like,
Oh.
it's in a development, you know, I think of places in like South Burlington where they had really long roads to get behind other development.
Oh.
And that might, it's not fragmenting the forest, but it's, but you still need a really long road.
And so it's just flagging that there's a. It took a bigger bite than perhaps it was intended to, or maybe it was intended to take the full bite, but the justification around the road rule is, or the focus around the road rule has always really been about preventing fragmentation.
Senator McCormick?
The road rule doesn't say if you're beyond a certain length, you can't do it. It says if you're beyond a certain length, you. Right. So the idea that it's only going behind a big box store, it's not gonna have a deleterious effect on the landscape. That's the answer to the question.
Yeah.
Then you go to the next question.
Once again, we're in agreement.
Let's see. Tier jurisdiction, we talked about a little bit, which is the next 6 or so sections of the bill. That 3-tier structure that's reflected in 687 is generally consistent with the NRB structure. I think there are still concerns around whether the tier 1A and 1B are actually broadly accessible to Vermont communities, and would really encourage you to hear from Commissioner Farrell. Tier 3 is kind of the main focus for A&R. As we've talked about, previous versions of the bill prescribed the definition for tier 3 in ways that resulted in some significant areas of the state falling under automatic jurisdiction. We do have maps of a couple of different approaches that were considered by the House that they'd be of interest to this committee. But just before crossover, House Environment did revise the tier 3 language to give a rulemaking assignment to the NRB to come up with those definitions. One thing I would note is that the around tier 3, the bill still says may include river corridors, headwaters, streams, habitat connectors of statewide significance. We support the rulemaking approach, but frankly would prefer to drop those specific references and simply let the working group come up with kind of the best definition and approach. And you know, the overall goal here, as we've understood it, is for tier 3 to be targeted and narrow and really focus on areas with the greatest risk from development that would benefit the most from Act 250 review. And that comes back to this conversation about how many additional projects are pulled into Act 250, and how we parameterize tier 3 is going to be critical in those conversations. And so there is an important balance to be struck here in terms of providing protection for truly critical resource areas and creating a regulatory system that is unsustainable.
Thank you. I have been like beating the drum on tier 3 in relation to high quality waters, and so that just feels like an automatic, probably should be in tier 3. Are there any automatic inclusions to tier 3 that you think just make sense?
I guess sitting here right now, no.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's critical connecting habitat, but that part of the challenge is Vermont conservation design takes a broad approach to identifying areas of the landscape that are important to overall habitat connectivity and ecological function. We don't need to necessarily conserve all of the land identified as highest priority in Vermont conservation design. We need a sampling of it, and the challenge becomes, how do you sample it in a way to create the landscape level mosaic we need to have that ecological function and habitat connectivity without getting into specific parcels. And that's work we haven't done yet, right? We've thrown at the highest level. We need some portion of everything that shows up in green on our Vermont conservation design map to have a level of protection, to have that ecological function. But how we narrow that in a way that doesn't end up pulling 70% of the landscape into automatic Act 250 jurisdiction, I think is a set of questions and analyses we haven't done yet.
Yes, that is clear, but do you see? Okay, but like the highest quality waters we have in the state, you don't think would be a tier 3, you just think the process would Cause it just seemed like this like a beautiful waterfall that's a class, you know, like a high class water, like why would that not be in tier? What concerns me is I hear your point where you're like, we might make too much tier 3. My concern is we're not gonna automatically include some obvious things that could be in tier 3 through this process. So I'm wondering, so there's no obvious, you think this would be an example of something for tier 3? That A and R would be, you wanna do a whole analysis before you comment?
Yes.
Okay. Trust. I mean, like top of balance kind of thing.
We, since we're due upstairs in a
3
minute,
minutes?
well, yeah, so I don't know if we should schedule more time or you were close to the end of your testimony.
I was very close to the end of my testimony, which is just to make one final plug for A&R staffing resources. The bill did add $125,000 in general fund in FY 25 and that one position in Fish and Wildlife. We had indicated long-term 4 positions, but really 3 in fiscal year 25, and that would be to support the various rulemakings, working groups, and some of the new criteria, development of some of the new criteria that directly implicate A&R's interests.
And then, so those are the same resources we we're talking about before, like, house, 1 FTE for department. Versus 1 for admin and 2 for department.
Correct, and I will get back to you on the question about if there's any additional beyond that for mapping, like contractual support around some of the mapping exercises. I don't know the answers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
You can see you have a very attentive audience, they have lots of questions.
Could we have the secretary just schedule her to come back as we start to combine the 2 bills?
Well, so I'm figuring we'll be scheduling lots of folks in the next week, and so I don't know if it's necessarily, what were you like?
It could be,
Sometimes it's-
I'm happy to come
sometimes
back. Billy Coster was our point person on the NRV study committee, and so as you get into more of the mechanics, he's probably best positioned to answer questions to be helpful.
So we'll stay in touch about what questions in general we think we're getting into. Because next week, I think we're gonna break it into more sections like appeals, tier definition, etc. And drill down on those and try to work them and close them so that we can. Hold your readers, clean ourselves out of the room, like we have to start closing things out and making what